Chapter 3. Getting the crystals in the first place had been easy. Sheer serendipity. Putting them back proved to be another matter entirely. For one thing, Professor Van Spee never left his office. It was one of those things that everybody else in the building, the secretaries, the partners, Mr. Tanner's mum, the cleaners, even the strange madwoman who came in once a month to talk nicely to the computers, knew, and he didn't. Because he'd bumped into Van Spee once in the photocopier room, and then, some time later, been left alone in the professor's office while the great man went to see old Mr. Wells, Paul had assumed he was vaguely nomadic, like everybody else in the building. At the very least, he reasoned, he must toddle off a couple of times a day to take a leak. Apparently not so. At one point in the fraught day that followed Paul's encounter with Colin, he almost made up his mind to confess, but he didn't. A right fool he'd feel, he decided, if he'd nerved himself to throw himself onto the professor's mercy, only to find out in mid-air, so to speak, that he hadn't got one. The day was long as well as nerve-wracking. First, as promised, they dismantled the Emerson projector, an astoundingly bizarre object that looked like a cross between a bird scarer and a washing machine, apparently used to isolate moments in the past that marked crucial turning points in courses of events. How it did that, Paul couldn't begin to guess, and the professor wasn't inclined to explain. Instead, Paul had to crawl about on the floor on his back with a spanner and a set of Allen keys, undoing nuts and bolts, pulling off casings and covers, dodging tiny little springs that came hurtling out like rocketing pheasants every time he undid something, then squirting cans of various cleaners and lubricants into ferocious-looking batteries of cams and cogs, and wiping gunk and slime out of slots and keyways with a bit of wadded-up paper towel. It was another hot day, even in the professor's office, which was always noticeably cooler than everywhere else, and Paul had to stop every few minutes to wipe sweat off his face with his sleeve. What with the sweat and the stale lemonade shandy from yesterday, it didn't smell very nice and tasted worse. Furthermore, he soon developed a thirst that would have disabled a hardened desert explorer, but the professor didn't seem to have heard of coffee breaks or anything of that sort. By the time he'd fitted back the last panel and tightened up the last locking nut and grub screw, his watch told him it was 11:10, but he could have sworn he'd been playing about with the horrible thing for at least 5 hours. All that time, of course, the professor hadn't moved from his chair. He'd just sat there and told Paul what to do, in his flat, slightly bleating voice, with special reference to procedures that Paul had either forgotten or wasn't to be trusted not to forget. Opportunities to sneak the crystals back into the jar in the desk? None. At least the next job on the list of things to do was sitting down work. That, however, was the best that could be said for it. "Here is a copy of an agreement," the professor said. "I have another copy of the same document. You will kindly read it out to me so I can check my copy for spelling mistakes and other errors. This is a very important contract, and it is essential that it should be word perfect." So Paul started to read. He hated reading aloud, and mostly to begin with it was just incomprehensible legal drivel, all "whereas the parties hereto" and "hereinafter where the context so permits defined as," and other great big galumphing phrases with huge hairy eyebrows and too many syllables. Slowly, though, Paul started to get an idea of what it was about. It was an agreement for the sale and purchase of a soul. "Correct," the professor confirmed, when at last they'd reached the end, and Paul's curiosity drove him to ask if his guess was accurate. "Ordinarily, spiritual convincing is not a major part of the workload of this department. Till recently the younger Mr. Wells dealt with it. However, since his departure—" Here the professor paused for a moment and looked at him, because of course it was Paul's doing that Mr. Wells Jr. had lost the power struggle with his uncle and had been turned into a photocopier. "I have looked after such matters. It is tedious work, and I must confess I have little sympathy for our clients. We generally act," he added deadpan, "for the purchasers in these transactions. However, it needs to be done, and it must be done carefully." He was silent for a minute or so as he examined the thick wodge of paper in his hand. Then he passed it to Paul across the desk. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to take this down to the typing pool and ask them to make the necessary corrections by 1 o'clock. It can then be checked again and bound up, in time for Mr. Shumway to deliver it by hand when he goes to the bank." Paul knew all about Benny Shumway's daily excursions to the Bank of the Dead, since he'd had to do the run himself on several memorable occasions. Right, he said as he stood up, delighted to be able to stretch his legs after sitting still for so long. Where is the typing pool exactly? I don't think I've ever... The professor gave him directions, which Paul was sure he wouldn't be able to follow. To a substantial extent, he believed they were physically and topographically impossible, because there'd be walls and things in the way. But he was wrong as usual. Doorways he'd somehow failed to notice in walls in corridors he'd walked up and down 10 times a day for 9 months turned out to be exactly where the professor had said they'd be. Stairwells sprang up at his feet like Jack's beanstalk at the end of passages that had been cul-de-sacs only days before. There was even a small, square, open-air courtyard to cross, a sort of cloister arrangement with a fountain and lemon trees in the middle, in what his sense of direction told him should have been the middle of the building next door. On the other hand, all Paul's relatives had told him many times that he was capable of getting lost in a matchbox, even if all the matches were still in it, so he guessed he was imagining it. Eventually he came to a door marked typing and knocked. No answer. Presumably he didn't knock, he just barged in, so he pushed it open and stepped through, and found himself standing on the tiled edge of a huge indoor swimming bath. The walls were blue, the roof was glass, and the whole place looked like something out of one of those underwater nature documentaries. The light danced on the ripples of the water, sending white dots and dashes careening up and down the walls. Instead of the usual chlorine smell, the air was thick with a strange blend of sea salt, coconut and banana. For a moment, Paul thought the bath was deserted, and then as he was about to turn and leave, something broke up through the still blue meniscus like a whale coming up to breathe. Fuck a ferret sideways, Paul thought. A mermaid! She bobbed up and down in the water a couple of times, sweeping her mane of wet brown hair out of her eyes. Then she became aware of Paul's presence, turned and waved. One of the tips of her tail broke the surface of the water, like the fin of a small shark. Mermaids don't wear swimming costumes, or tops of any kind. Paul spun round and faced the door he'd just come through, his face burning. "Hello," said the mermaid. "I'm Vicky. Who are you?" At that particular moment, that was a very good question, because for the life of him, Paul couldn't remember. Somehow he pulled himself together, but it took some doing. Paul Carpenter, he said. "Sorry." "That's all right. I don't suppose you can help it." A faint giggle. "What are you sorry about?" I didn't know. I wasn't staring or anything. You just sort of popped up before I could... Before you could what? Paul cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. "I was looking for the typing pool." As he said the words, the penny came crashing down like a thunderbolt. Typing pool. The mermaid giggled again. "You found it. Have you got something for us to do?" Paul nodded. "From Professor Van Spee. He says, can you please have it ready for 1 o'clock? The mermaid groaned. "Not that horrible long contract," she complained. "I've done it 5 times already. Now what's wrong with the bloody thing?" "Oh, just a few minor bits and pieces," Paul said, and for some reason his voice was all wobbly. "It won't take 5 minutes on the computer." "We don't use computers, silly," Vicky the mermaid interrupted. "We live underwater. Water's not very good for electrical appliances." Oh. "Yes, oh," he heard her sigh. "Big old-fashioned sit-up-and-beg typewriters are what we use. Only they're all stainless steel, so they won't rust, which means I'll have to do the whole rotten thing all over again from scratch. Never mind," she added, her tone of voice changing slightly. "Can't be helped, and I don't suppose it's your fault." "Thanks," Paul said, "and I'm sorry." "I forgive you." Pause. "Well?" Sorry?" "Would you mind awfully bringing it over here so I can get on with it? I can't come over there and fetch it, you see, on account of not having any legs." Paul cringed. A part of him told him he was being a bit bloody silly, since obviously the mermaid didn't mind a bit, and what he'd seen the split second before he shut his eyes had been very nice. But he was still very much Paul Carpenter, so he made a valiant effort to judge the distance and, eyes still glued to the door, started to walk backwards. It took a whole 10 seconds for the inevitable to happen. Then he was falling through the air for perhaps a quarter of a second, and then the water hit him on the back of his head and wrapped itself all around him. To be fair to him, Paul knew how to swim. He even had a piece of paper somewhere to prove it. But that was proper deliberate swimming on purpose, where you take your clothes off and fold them neatly and put them on bathing trunks and climb in backwards down a little ladder. Swimming where you're suddenly submerged in freezing cold water that fills your mouth and ears, and you're wearing lace-up shoes and a jacket and tie hadn't been covered in the syllabus when he earned his little bit of paper, and he realised he didn't know how to do it. Drowning, on the other hand, was apparently something that just comes naturally. "Keep still," said a voice in his ear, or maybe inside his head. Then something hit him on the point of the jaw and all the lights went out. He was a ship, drifting along on a yellow sea. He was a hawk wheeling along through yellow clouds until he saw a gap, and through it, far below, a flat green landscape and a grey stone tower. He swooped, and as he got closer to the ground, the tower grew, reaching up to meet him like a stone arm pushing up out of the earth. He landed on a weathered battlement and folded his wings. Below him lay the main courtyard, where the tower's garrison were busy with their chores, grooming horses, burnishing armour with handfuls of sand and straw, practising archery at the butts, cutting hay, raking muck out the stables, drying newly washed linen. Unnoticed by these busy people, he fluttered down and perched on the edge of an open door next to a large grindstone on which someone was sharpening a wide-bladed axe. He recognised the axe, had a feeling that at some stage he might even have known its name. A few yards to his right, a pig had nosed and shouldered its way out of its pen, and was having a wonderful time being chased around the yard by half a dozen tired and angry men. They were shouting at it in a strange dialect of French. Most of the vocabulary was unfamiliar to him, but it didn't stop him getting the general idea. The main stable door swung open, and two men led out a fine black horse, tall and broad enough to pull a brewer's dray, but fine-boned and immaculately turned out. Over a rich red saddlecloth lay a saddle of tooled green leather, highlighted in gold leaf, with gilded stirrups swinging from the straps. The grooms led the horse to a mounting block standing against the courtyard's north wall, where a tall man in extravagantly ostentatious clothes was waiting, accompanied by half a dozen servants. The well-dressed man, clearly a great lord, swung himself easily into the saddle, picked up the reins in his left hand, and held out his right arm, hand gauntleted and clenched. It was a gesture of invitation and summons, so he spread his wings and fluttered head high across the yard, turned and dropped neatly onto the lord's wrist, a suitably perfect landing. Today, the great man told him in a soft, firm voice, they were going out after doves, pheasant and woodcock on the edge of the large stand of pine on the southern boundary of the park, and he must make a special effort and hunt diligently, because tomorrow the king himself would be guest at the castle as he broke his journey east from Toronto to the capital. "You're all wet," said the mermaid. This was true. Paul was very wet indeed. There was enough water in his socks alone to wash out all 14 days of Wimbledon. When he opened his eyes, they stung and he rubbed them. "You fell in," the mermaid told him. "It was your own silly fault. You were walking backwards, so you couldn't see where you were going. Can't you swim?" Yes," Paul said. "Well, a bit. I was doing fine, actually, till somebody hit me." "Sure you were," the mermaid said. Her face was only inches away from his, and her thick, wavy brown hair seemed perfectly dry. It had golden highlights, so pale they were almost white. They reminded Paul of something, but he couldn't for the life of him think what. "Professor Van Spee's contract," he croaked. "Did I mention it's really urgent?" "Done," the mermaid replied. "While you were out cold. It's all ready. Top copy and 2 carbons. You'll need to get out of those wet things before you catch your death." "No, really, I'm fine," Paul said, altogether in a rush. "There's a radiator in my office. I'll dry off. I'll better be getting back, or the professor will be wondering why I'm taking so long." She only smiled and started peeling off his jacket. Her eyes were exactly the colour of the water, blue and deep enough to drown in if you happen not to be a strong swimmer. "How's your jaw?" she was saying. "I didn't mean to hit you quite so hard, but you were thrashing about like a gaffed shark." It's fine," Paul said, as the sleeves of his jacket slithered past his hands. Then her fingers were at his throat, prizing apart the knot of his tie. "Don't you ever stop wriggling about?" she asked him. "The way you're carrying on, anybody would think you were the fish out of the water." Good point. He realised, on the tiled edge of the pool, and she was kneeling over him. Something ought not to be possible without something to kneel with. He made a point of not looking down and mumbled, "Shouldn't you be?" She laughed. "Hans Christian Andersen to you," she said, "and it's all right. You're safe. You can look." He ventured a quick, furtive glance and saw she was wearing a white blouse and plain navy blue skirt. He relaxed a bit, but she was still very close, and her fingernails were brushing the skin of his neck. "I go walking 3 times a week," she said proudly. "Last Tuesday I walked 17 lengths, and I borrowed Christine's catalogue and sent off for a pair of shoes. The pointy ones, with the big nail things sticking out of the back end." She frowned. "You probably know this," she went on, "but what's the nail thing for exactly? I'm guessing it's like a sort of claw for holding your prey still while you finish it off." Paul smiled feebly. "Something like that," he said. "Thought so. And what about the net things you wear around your legs? What are they for? Christine says you're supposed to pull them right up over your thighs, but I can't see what makes them stay up. And do men wear them, or only women?" She had overcome his tie and started on his shirt buttons. "First thing when I get home this evening," he promised himself, "I'm going to make that medicine and bugger give him back the crystals." "Look," he said, swiping her hand away as though swatting a huge fly. "It's really kind of you, but I'll change when I get home. Bit of water never hurt anybody." And then he sneezed. "Anyway, thanks very much for saving me from drowning, but I really ought to get on. You wouldn't happen to know the time, would you?" She frowned thoughtfully. "Time," she repeated. "No, can't say as I do. What's it look like?" "That'll do me," Paul thought. "I'm out of here." "Thanks again," he spluttered, jumped to his feet, slithered and bounded toward the door, and then he realised he'd forgotten Van Spee's stupid contract. The mermaid was standing behind him, smiling sweetly, holding it out for him. He took it from her. It weighed a ton, and he felt the tendons in his wrist twang like guitar strings, and fled, letting the door slam behind him. In the corridor he stopped, caught his breath, and tucked the contract carefully under his arm. Water dripped from Paul's trousers and puddled embarrassingly on the carpet. A fat drop trickled down his forehead and into his right eye. He looked at his watch, but of course it had stopped. Wearily he squelched back the way he'd come, happily not meeting anybody on the way. They still hadn't got round to replacing the blown light bulb on the 3rd-floor stairs. The world, Paul decided, was a wretched, miserable place. "You're wet," Theo Van Spee told him as he shuffled through the door. "There's a towel on your chair, and dry clothes in the Marks and Spencer's bag on the floor to your right, next to the waste paper basket. You will wish to get changed in the lavatory at the end of the corridor. Nobody else will want to use it today, and you may therefore hang up your wet clothes to dry. You will be just in time to catch Mr. Janway before he leaves for the bank. I shall not need you any more today." Benny seemed preoccupied and didn't hang around to chat. Paul knew that even now he dreaded the daily banking run, and with good reason, so he dumped the contract on the desk and left, heading back to his office. When he got there, he found the new partner, Mr. Lairtide, sitting on the edge of his desk, eating an apple. "Your hair's all wet," Mr. Lairtide said. "Raining out, is it?" For all I know, Paul decided, it could very well be. "Yes," he said. Is there anything I can do for you?" Mr. Lairtide took another bite of his apple and sank his teeth into it, and then pulled his hand away so that a chunk of apple flesh was torn off. Then he dumped the core in Paul's bin. "So tell me," he said, "what was it really like? Finding it out with Countess Judy. Scary, I bet." Paul nodded. "Would it be all right if I didn't talk about it?" he said. "Please yourself," Mr. Lairtide said with his mouth full. "Point is, you're working with Theo Van Spee right now, and after that you're booked for 2 months with Kaz Suslovich, Castles in the Air and so forth. Just thought, though, you might like to sandwich in a few weeks with me. Only I'm building a rather juicy deal right now that'll be starting to get interesting about the time you're due to finish with Theo, and I thought you might like to be in on it. I saw in your personnel file, Judy reckoned you've got the knack, and say what you like about her. She was bloody good at the job. What do you say?" Difficult, Paul thought. The truth was, of course, that he'd rather scrub sewers with a toothbrush than have anything to do with magic of any sort. But since he didn't have that option, one form of unspeakableness was pretty much the same as any other. On the other hand, Mr. Suslovich had struck him as the least offensive of the J.W. gang. On Paul's first day in the job, he had sent him down a map of the building so he could find his way about through the nightmare tangle of corridors and staircases. True, Mr. Suslowich's map had turned out to be no more than 40% accurate, and where it was wrong, it was usually disastrously wrong. The first floor small interview room had proved to be a store for 8-foot-tall man-shaped wicker cages, and Mr. Suslovich had marked the blue door opposite the window on the second floor landing as a stationery cupboard, when in fact it was a ladies' toilet. In spite of that, Paul had been sort of looking forward to 2 months in civil engineering, whereas Mr. Laertied's was very much an unknown quantity. Fortunately, inspiration struck. "I'll ask Mr. Tanner what he thinks," Paul said. He's sort of in charge of that kind of arrangement, so—" "Fair enough." Mr. Laertied stood up. He moved jerkily like bad animation. "We'll see at Rosie's later for the rehearsal." On his way to the door, he paused. "One last thing," he added, rather in the style of Lieutenant Columbo. "Have you had a chance to brew up the medicine yet?" As far as Paul was concerned, his life over the last 9 months had turned into the sort of experience you'd expect if Dante had designed the rides at Alton Towers. Mostly he seemed to be trapped in the one where you're swept along down a pitch-dark underground river in an open boat, and the branches of overhanging trees keep smacking you in the face. "Medicine?" he repeated. "You know," said Mr. Laertied, with a hint of impatience, "the jollop, the stuff that us will be falling in love every 2 minutes. Theo told me you went ferreting about in his old books one time when you thought he wasn't looking. Then he nicked a load of his special patent wonder crystals from the jar in his desk drawer. So Theo guessed you were planning on making the stuff. Bloody good idea, he thought. It'll help you keep your mind on your work instead of drooping around the place like a weasel with malaria. Well, only if you haven't done it yet, maybe you'd like a hand. It's not exactly rocket science, chucking a few ingredients in a saucepan, but that's not exactly defrosting an Aztec cannelloni either." Mr. Laertied's frowned. His whole face seemed to clench inwards, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it. "You want my help, or don't you? Up to you, of course, but I do happen to have a master's degree in supernatural chemistry, whereas you can just about boil an egg without blowing up most of northwest London." The last part was true enough. "Excuse me," Paul said cautiously, "but why would you, a partner and all, want to spend valuable fee-earning time helping me do something that's nothing to do with work?" Mr. Laertied's face went blank for a moment, and then he laughed. "Suspicious soul, aren't you? Not a bad thing either, in this trade, and after the Countess Judy business and all, I don't blame you. Always wise to have a gander at gift horses' teeth, just in case they're about to meet in your neck." He reached out a hand. It was almost as though he had a telescopic arm that extended from the elbow, and dealt Paul a staggering blow on the shoulder. "But it's okay," he said. "You don't need to worry about me. Fact is, we're going to be working together from now on, and I don't hold with all that stuffy them and us crap. It's completely counterproductive in my experience. If we're going to be on the same team, I'd rather like us to be mates, and mates help each other. Right? Or would you rather stick with the unappeasable hatred school of industrial relations?" "Well, no," Paul said, when the silence got too much for him. No, obviously. I just didn't want to, trespass on your good nature or anything." "Bollocks," said Mr. Laertied, and his face dissolved and reformed into a jovial scowl. "You're thinking, this bloke's up to something, and he's a partner, so he's got to be a right bastard, which is fine," he added, "but it's not getting your medicine brewed, and you don't even know where to buy creme fraiche, whereas I just happen to have a spare half hour and a pot of the stuff upstairs in a staff-room fridge, so you up for it or not? You can lead a horse to water, and even though you can't necessarily make it drink, you can stick a hosepipe up its nose and turn on the tap." "Yes," Paul said. "I mean, thanks, that'd be really great, so long as you're sure it's no bother." "No trouble at all." Mr. Laertied's immediately became a smile on legs. "You scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's what makes the world go round." From the top pocket of his suit jacket he pulled a piece of paper, a photocopy of a page from a book. Now then, apart from the crystals and the creme fraiche, we need anchovies, floor wax, trichloroethylene, fresh cucumber, turpentine, paracetamol, mutton fat, charcoal, chalk dust, black lead, extra virgin olive oil, salt, sulphurs, cornflour, starch, Epsom salts, butter, eggs, flour, monosodium glutamate, and permitted colourants and flavourings. He was ticking items off the list with the stub of a pencil that had materialised behind his ear as soon as he reached up for it. No problems there. We've got all of that in the stores. Equipment, let's see. We'll want a Groninger crucible. That's easy enough. Just cut the neck of a plastic milk bottle. An ethane burner rated to 3 billion BTU. Triple action refractory chamber. Yes, got that. Or just standard slab kit, really. And a tin opener, of course. No, he concluded, folding the paper up and vanishing it into the palm of his hand. No difficulties there. You've got the crystals. We'll stop off in the staff room and then press on to the lab on the 4th floor. Piece of cake, really. As Paul followed Mr. Laytides up the stairs, it occurred to him, when he could spare a moment or two from trying to catch his breath, that 70 St. Mary Axe didn't have a 4th floor. He kept quiet, however, and that proved to be just as well, because he'd only have shown his ignorance. Mr. Laytides led the way past Professor Van Spee's office, down a corridor that Paul had never explored, to a small door painted an improbable shade of primrose yellow. It opened onto a narrow circular staircase, the sort of thing you'd expect to find in a church steeple or castle tower. At the top was another yellow door on which someone had painted "Défense d'entrée" in huge green letters. It opened a split second before Mr. Laytides gave it a shove, and beyond it lay a long, bright, sparse room, lined with melamine-topped workbenches, cluttered with retorts, Bunsen burners, fume cupboards, old-fashioned brass microscopes, and all manner of scientific junk, the likes of which Paul hadn't seen since his last school chemistry lesson. On hooks in the butter-coloured wall hung a row of several dozen brown lab coats. Mr. Laytides grabbed two as he swept past, tossed one over his shoulder to Paul, and wriggled into the other without breaking stride. "Lots to do," he called, without looking round. He was pulling open a huge store cupboard at the back of the room, hauling out jars and packets and bottles without needing to look at the labels. "Light up a Bunsen, would you, and fill up a couple of those 5-litre beakers with clean water." After a long and frustrating search, Paul found a matchbox containing precisely one match and lit the gas. By now, the pile of ingredients was so tall that he could only just see the top of Miss Laytide's head. He drew the water from the tap in the middle of the centre bench. The room, he noticed, had a frosted glass roof but no windows, and no electric light, no electric points either, or electrical equipment of any kind. Odd, surely, for a modern laboratory. Mr. Laytides was humming as he worked, but he was a lousy hummer, and the tune sounded like nothing on earth. Filling the beakers turned out to be the last chore assigned to him. Mr. Laytides did everything else himself, shuffling and scuttling up and down the workbenches like a huge, long-legged crab. Pretty soon he had no less than 6 Bunsens roaring away, each one warming a big glass vessel on a tripod stand. Fiddly arrangements of rubber and glass tube linked each vessel to its neighbours. There were filters like yuppie coffee makers, and things gripped in steel claws on clamps, and vents where waste gas was burned off. It all looked like a cross between a black and white Frankenstein's workshop and the old mousetrap game that Paul had played with as a kid. Presumably there was a point to it all. Coming along, Mr. Laytides chirruped. Fuck, where did I put the litmus paper? Tell me if the stuff in that end flask goes purple. If it does, we'll have 7 seconds to get up before the whole lot blows and they start flying in emergency cartographers from the continent to redraw all the maps. Oh, that's good, that's excellent. Here Mr. Laytides paused to admire the bubbles rising from a pool of clear liquid in the bottom of a beaker. Told you there was nothing to it, really. Paul cleared his throat. Mr. Laytides? Frank, just call me Frank. Sorry to bother you, Paul said, but I don't remember any of this from when I copied the recipe out of the book. Mr. Laytides grinned. Just as well I stepped in then, isn't it? See, that formula was written for the trade. It's assumed you know how to use it, all the different basic techniques. Like it says, clarify 2 ounces of mutton fat dissolved in turpentine. Sounds like you don't know how to clarify. Well, do you? Thought not. I didn't spend 20 years learning all this stuff just for something to do, you know. Paul could take a hint, especially one which landed with the terminal velocity of a large meteorite. He'd stood back, stayed out of the way, while Mr. Laytides worked and tried to keep himself amused by reading the labels of the bottles in the store cupboard. There was aqua regia and aqua fortis, sweet spirits of nitre and salt of wormwood, lunar caustic and oil of Mars, and peach ash and pearl ash and calomel, butter and bloom and glance of antimony, bitter salts and blue vitriol, killed spirits, tincture of steel, liver of sulphur and corrosive sublimate, and not a single newt's eye or frog store to be found anywhere. At the very back of the cupboard, among the wreaths of cobweb and moraines of dust, he found a tiny bottle whose label read Van Spee's Crystals. But it was empty. "All done," sang out Mr. Lairtides. "Completo, finito, come and get it while it's hot." He was holding out a clear plastic pot, marginally bigger than an upturned thimble. "I'd knock it back in one if I were you," he went on. "Probably doesn't taste too wonderful. I don't know, haven't actually tried it for obvious reasons." Paul looked at it with a certain degree of horror, then did as he was told. It was only slightly warm, and had no perceptible taste whatever. Is that it?" he said. "Yes," Mr. Lairtides confirmed. He was red in the face and sweating a little. He'd taken off his jacket at some point and rolled up his sleeves, revealing long, thin, white forearms, completely hairless. "My guess is it'll be half an hour before it takes effect, and you may feel a bit drowsy, so don't drive or operate heavy machinery. Aside from that, though, that should be you seen to for at least 6 months before you need topping up." He was putting things away, wiping the desktop, stopping bottles and jars, dismantling glass and rubber tubing. "And the good part is we'll be testing it straight away, because there's bound to be 1 or 2 cute chicks at the rehearsal this evening. But now you'll be able to look 'em in the eye and walk straight past, and that's one less set of hideous complications in your life." Paul thought about that. "Thanks," he said. "Thanks very much, Frank. You've got no idea how much this will mean to me, and you're sure it'll work?" He couldn't help adding, "You bet." Mr. Lairtides nodded his head 4 times in rapid succession. "Fact is, though, I've never made this one before. It's quite like all your basic love filter recipes. Sounds the reason if you think about it. And I've been making them for 30 years. He just put something in his pocket, absent-mindedly and without thinking. Now he paused, frowned, took it out again. "Silly me," he said, and opened his hand, revealing the aspirin bottle still nearly full of yellow crystals. "I'll expect you want to hang on to these," he continued. "I sort of got the impression that Theo wasn't expecting to get them back. You never know when they might come in you handy." Paul didn't make any attempt to take them. "Aren't they, sort of valuable?" he asked. "What? Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, a bit. I suppose this lot will be worth a bob or 2 on the black market. But if you sell them, what will you do in 6 months' time when you've got to make the next batch? Up to you, of course, but—" "That's all right," Paul said firmly, taking the bottle. "I'll make sure I keep them very safe. Yes, you think the Professor didn't mind me helping myself like that?" Mr. Lairtides grinned. "The fact that you're standing there would tend to suggest that," he said. "If Theo was upset with you, by now you'd be nothing but a memory and a faint smell of burning. Don't worry, though. He makes the stuff, so there's plenty more where that came from, far as he's concerned. What's the time, by the way? It just struck me I better go and get changed if I'm going to this rehearsal thing. Can't show up Rosie's shindig looking like this, can I?" Mr. Lairtides was wearing a plain blue suit. So was Paul. "Can't you? Ought I to change as well? She didn't say anything." "Don't worry about it," Mr. Lairtides said. "What you're wearing will be the least of your problems." He held the door open so Paul could go through. "You carry on," he said. "I'll just make sure everything's shipshape and then lock up." "Half an hour," he'd said. Paul went slowly down the stairs and made for his office. The brewing process had taken a bit longer than Mr. Lairtides had predicted, an hour rather than 30 minutes. That left half an hour till going home time, just long enough for the medicine to work. He sat down at his desk, which was noteless and memo-free, and rested his elbows on top. If it works, he thought, if it worked, if only, then it'd be goodbye to a whacking great chunk of the pain of being Paul Carpenter. And wouldn't that be good? No more falling in love, no more wild, hopeless crushes, no more drifting around, bumping into things and absent-mindedly walking through shop windows, no more drooping, sighing, yearning, making an utter and unmitigated prat of himself. He'd be able to walk down the street without needing to look down or away every time a girl came into view. He grinned as a picture formed in his mind of the arch persecutor Cupid who'd hounded him all these years like a chubby pink Captain Ahab, howling at him in baffled fury from his white fluffy cloud, safe for the first time since he was 11, assuming it worked, of course. But if it worked, what a wonderful world this would be. They could do what they liked. Girls of every shape, size, height and weight. They could hunt him in packs for all he cared, but it wouldn't do them any good. Just imagine, a world without fear. Only an hour or two ago he'd been ambushed by Vicky the mermaid. Been lucky to get out of that one with nothing worse than a plunge into deep water. Before that, there'd been the faked Melza Horrocks, a hateful trap set for him by the Countess Judy, into which he'd blundered like a honey-starved heffalump. And before that there'd been Sophie, and look where that had led. Thank you, he thought. Thank you, nice Mr. Lairtides, even if you are as weird as 9 pink ferrets in a blender. If I can be spared another sleigh ride down plumbing like that, I can't ever thank you enough. If it worked, it'd almost be enough to reconcile him to all this magic stuff forever. Almost. The door swung open and Paul looked up. For once, Mr. Tanner's mum hadn't bothered to disguise herself. She stood in the doorway in her goblin face and skin, all long, curved teeth, round red eyes and short bristles. He knew she wasn't really supposed to walk around like that before the office closed for the evening, and somehow he knew it was meant to be a friendly gesture, like a white flag denoting a brief ceasefire, a short interval during which they could share cups of tea in no man's land and sing Silent Night together until the howitzers started up again. Of course, it was only because he was doing her a favour, coming to a stupid rehearsal. "Thought I'd make sure you didn't forget and slip away early," she said, parking herself on the edge of his desk. "You tend to do things like that, teabag memory, as my Uncle Howdy would say." Paul grinned feebly. "How are we getting there?" he said. I don't even know where we're going." "Don't worry about it," she replied. "I'll make sure you get there. Besides, we aren't going far. Walking distance." He followed her down the corridor, past the closed file store, up the back stairs to the photocopier room, along the passage leading to Mr. Suslowich's office, though last week it had been on the first floor and now it was on the second, through the staff room fire escape, which actually led down a tunnel, a marble-faced tube 8 feet in diameter, going straight ahead and slightly uphill, which, if you stopped to think about it, was absolutely impossible. Down the tunnel for what felt like half a mile, through massive steel doors. "It's not much," said Mr. Tanner's mum, "but it's home." It was a huge open space, sand-floored like an arena, circular, the bottom of another vast tube, so tall the other end, a dazzling blue circle looked no bigger than a sequin. Paul realised he was facing the stands of an amphitheatre, row upon row of stone benches raked steeply uphill, almost but not entirely surrounding him. 300 degrees of seats, and every single one appeared to have a goblin in it. "Meet the folks," Mr. Tanner's mum whispered in his ear. "Just think, every one of them is your long-lost cousin." Her claws were gripping his shoulder like a G-clamp, so running for it wasn't on the cards, unless he fancied leaving his arm behind. "Now what?" he hissed back. "You never did tell me what I'm supposed to do." "No," she replied, "I didn't." Then he felt her hand in the small of his back, and he shot forward, scrambling furiously to keep from treading on his own feet. A devastating wall of sound hit him. It was the goblins, all cheering at the same time. Paul had always wondered what it'd be like to be really popular, but in his daydreams it hadn't been like this. "You know, I told you this was a rehearsal," Mr. Tanner's mum whispered in his ear. Yes?" "I lied. It's a real thing, not something you can rehearse if you get my meaning." The rampart of faces staring at him were blurring, melding into one vast composite goblin grin. "It'd lose that fresh impromptu edge, you mean?" he said. "That too, but think about it. What things are there you can truly ever do once in a lifetime?" Before Paul could say anything, he sensed that she had gone, and he stood there, alone, in front of maybe 20,000 goblins, reflecting on the last thing she'd said. Offhand, his mental agility somewhat impaired by the context, he could think of 3 things that fitted her criteria. None of them were things he'd want to do in front of a crowd, and 2 of them he'd done already. No, belay that, all 3. Even so, a polished bronze trapdoor 12 feet square appeared in the sand in front of him and gradually slid open, with much rumbling of chains and grunching of badly lubricated moving parts. No prizes for guessing which of the 3 Mr. Tanner's mum had in mind. Something fell at his feet with a thud, just missing his toes. He glanced down and saw a long, wide-bladed sword with a pink ribbon incongruously fastened round the handle. In this life, he could distinctly remember his dad saying when he was 14 and asking for the money to go on a school trip to Bruges, "There are times when you just have to make sacrifices." Among the goblin community, it seemed, christenings were just such an occasion. Help, he thought, but without any great enthusiasm. No point, and it'd be too bad if the last emotion he ever experienced was disappointment. Meanwhile, the trapdoor had slid wide open, and up through it, on a slowly rising platform, appeared a cake. A huge, enormous ziggurat of a cake, with battlements of piped white icing, candles like ship's masts, spun sugar bubbles like cannonballs, and a single glacé cherry on the top like the dome of the Kremlin. Its bottom tier was fenced around with a silver foil wrapper as tall as the ramparts of Constantinople, and written on it in Prussian blue letters 5 yards high were the words, "Happy Christening, Paul Earsock Tanner." Something you only do once in a lifetime. Cut the first slice of a fucking great big cake. Well, Paul thought, of course, silly me not to have figured it out earlier. "Go on in," hissed a voice off stage, so he putted across the stand towards it. Took him 2 minutes to get there, and he was trying not to dawdle. The crowd had gone deathly quiet. Here and there flash guns popped, but otherwise there was no movement in the encircling goblin cliffs. When he reached the foot of the cake, he craned his neck up until it hurt, and still couldn't see the top. Never mind, he was here now. He could do his job, and then, presumably, that was his part in the proceedings over with. Deep breath, and then he swung the sword up over his head and buried it up to the hilt in the cake wall before him. It went in easily enough. Fist-sized shards of white sugar cracked off and rained down around him like plaster from a ceiling, and around the wound he'd made, great cracks and fissures started to appear. Paul dragged the sword free and stepped back. Crushed flat by an avalanche of cake crumbs would be a really silly way to die. The cake was definitely starting to split open. He could hear the groans and creaks of stressed fabric, like a great tree torn apart with wedges. Suddenly, in a fraction of a second, the wall gave way, and out through the side of the cake burst a bevy, only word for it, of beautiful young women in spangly bikinis with tinsel wreaths wound in their piled-up blonde hair. They rushed forward towards him, squealing. Goblin taste, he thought, just what you'd expect from a people in whose mythology the sun was formed from the bronzed baby shoe of the sky god. Utterly naff, but nevertheless harmless enough in its way. Then the party girls were all around him, and Paul suddenly, but too late, remembered the one thing about goblins he'd been sure he'd never forget, as the bimbo nearest to him changed seamlessly back into her true shape and swung at the side of his head with a double-headed battle-axe. Somehow he managed to get his sword up to block the slash. He could feel the shock of impact jarring the tendons of his arms right down into both elbows. The goblin hissed furiously through her curved yellow fangs and stepped back to start another swing. Meanwhile, the goblin next to her was lunging at his solar plexus with a triple-barbed lance. He avoided that too, mainly because his shoelace had come undone and he'd stood on it, and the ensuing stumble took him out of the way of the lance's needle-sharp point. Unfortunately, as he staggered and fell, a goblin to his right stepped forward and jabbed at him with a halberd, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Paul heard an explosion of cheering as the blade slid into him, and as the light grew pale and the focus softened, his last conscious thought was that just for once he appeared to have lived up to someone's expectations. Well, not lived up, actually the exact opposite, but